The snow fell on Ashenvale Estate the night Anastasia left. It fell without ceremony, without warning, the way grief often does, quietly in the dark while the rest of the world slept and did not notice. She was 22 years old. Her trunks had been packed by her own hands, not by the maids, because she had not wanted anyone to see how few things she chose to take. A Bible, 3 dresses, a single portrait, small enough to fit inside a hatbox, of a man she had told herself she would forget. She had not forgotten him. She had simply buried the memory of him the way one buries something precious and dangerous, deeply, carefully, in a place where she would not be tempted to dig. Duke Magnus had been away when it happened. That was the cruelest part, or perhaps the most merciful, depending on who was asked. He had ridden to the Northern Territories on a matter of inheritance dispute, the kind of tedious legal obligation that consumed months of a nobleman's life without ever producing anything worth remembering. He had kissed Anastasia's hand before he left. He had told her he would be back before the harvest moon. He had been back before the harvest moon. But she had not been there to see it rise. The letter she left had been exactly 14 words long. The steward, a man named Carver who had served the estate for 30 years and had seen every variety of human sorrow, had read it 3 times before he trusted himself to carry it upstairs. He had found the Duke in the east study, still wearing his riding coat, still smelling of winter and exhaustion and the particular loneliness of men who have been too long away from home. He had handed the letter over without speaking. He had stood in the doorway and watched the Duke read it. And he had never, in 30 years of service, seen a man go so still so quickly. The letter did not explain. That was what Magnus would think about in the years that followed, not what the letter said, but what it did not say. It did not say why. It did not say whether she had been unhappy. It did not say whether she had ever, in the 3 years of their marriage, looked at him across the dinner table and felt anything other than polite and practiced indifference. It said only that she was going to the convent of St. Marin on the eastern cliffs. It said that she needed God more than she needed the life she was living. It said that she was sorry. Magnus had folded the letter. He had placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, against his chest, where it had stayed, moving from coat to coat as seasons changed, for 7 years. He had not sent after her. He had stood at the window of the east study and watched the snow fall on his empty courtyard and made himself understand, with the brutal clarity that some men mistake for strength, that a woman who chose God over him had made her choice clearly enough. He had not sent after her. He would tell himself in the years that followed that this had been the dignified thing to do. He would tell himself many things. Society, of course, had opinions. Society always had opinions. It was perhaps the thing society did best, manufacturing opinions the way lesser establishments manufactured bread, in great quantities, without particular attention to quality. The Countess of Whitmore had told anyone who would listen that Anastasia had always been strange. Too quiet, too serious. The kind of woman who reads philosophy when she ought to be planning menus, who looks out windows when she ought to be looking at her husband. The Marchioness of Delvane had been more sympathetic. She had said, in the careful tones of a woman who chooses her words with the precision of a surgeon choosing instruments, that it was a great tragedy, and that Magnus deserved better, and that she hoped he would not suffer too terribly. Magnus had attended precisely 3 social engagements in the months after Anastasia left. At first, he had been asked about her 11 times. At the second, 7 times. At the third, twice. After that, people had learned, through whatever mysterious mechanism governs the behavior of aristocratic circles, that the subject was not to be raised in his presence. He had not discouraged the lesson. The dining room at Ashenvale was the finest room in the estate. Magnus' mother had designed it 40 years before with the kind of extravagant attention to proportion that characterized the women of her generation, women who understood that a room was not merely a room but a statement, a declaration of what the family within it believed about beauty and order and the proper conduct of life. There was a table of dark mahogany that seated 20. There were windows that looked out over the south gardens, and in summer the light through those windows turned everything amber, and in winter the snow outside made the candlelight seem warmer by contrast. There were 20 chairs around that table. The chair to the right of the Duke's, the place of honor, the chair of the Duchess, had been Anastasia's. On the night she left, The servants had prepared for dinner as usual. The table had been set for two. The candles had been lit. The soup had grown cold in its tureen before Carver had quietly, without being instructed, ordered the table cleared. He had expected to be told, in the days that followed, to rearrange the seating, to remove the extra place setting, to redistribute the chairs so that the empty space would not announce itself so loudly at every meal. He was never told this. The chair remained. The first winter without her, Magnus had noticed the chair every night. He had not looked at it. He was not a man given to theatrical grief, not a man who would stare openly at an empty chair like a figure in a painting meant to illustrate the concept of loss. But he had noticed it, the way one notices a sound that is missing, the absence of something that had previously been present, leaving a shape in the air where it used to be. He had eaten his meals with the particular efficiency of men who are eating alone and know it and do not see the point of pretending otherwise. He had worked through correspondence at dinner, which he had never done when Anastasia was present, because she had disapproved of working at table, and he had found, in their 3 years of marriage, that he had cared more about her approval than he had ever admitted to himself. She had not been a warm woman. That was important to understand. She had not been the kind of wife who pressed her hand to his arm and laughed at his jokes and made a man feel chosen and seen. She had been precise and controlled and occasionally remote in the way of people who have learned, through some early injury the details of which Magnus had never been trusted with, that warmth is a vulnerability. But she had been present. She had been across the table, with her straight back and her dark eyes and her habit of cutting her food into exact, equal portions before eating any of it. She had been real in the way that only a person you share daily life with can be real. Not the idea of a person but the actual, flawed, particular human being who uses your soap and disagrees with your reading choices and occasionally looks out the window for so long you begin to wonder what she sees there. He missed the reality of her. He had not expected to miss it so much. By the second winter, the chair had become something else. He could not have named what, precisely. A monument, perhaps, or a question, or simply the most honest thing in the room, the one thing that did not pretend she had never existed, did not rearrange itself to fill the space she had left, did not move on in the polite and relentless way that everything else moved on. His solicitor, a brisk man named Hartwell, had raised the question of annulment in the second year. Magnus had looked at him for a long moment. Hartwell had not raised the question again. The chair remained to the right of the Duke's place. The table was still set for 2 every evening, soup to dessert, whether the Duke intended to eat a full meal or not. The candles in the holder nearest that seat were replaced each morning, lit each evening, and burned down each night whether anyone sat beside them or not. The servants understood, collectively and without discussion, that this was simply how things were at Ashenvale. They did not speak of it outside the estate. They were loyal people. Loyalty, in a house shaped by that kind of quiet grief, becomes a form of love. The third year brought a fever to the eastern provinces, and with it a season of unusual correspondence. Magnus found himself writing letters to administrative bodies, to relief organizations, to men in the capital who controlled the distribution of medical supplies and who needed to be reminded repeatedly that the Eastern Territories were not merely inconvenient footnotes on a map but actual places containing actual people with actual fevers. He wrote the letters. He followed up on the letters. He traveled twice to the capital and sat in overheated rooms arguing with men who wore expensive coats and had never once ridden through a village where the children were sick. He was effective. He had always been effective. Effectiveness was the one thing Magnus had never doubted about himself, the ability to look at a problem clearly, identify what needed to be done, and do it without flinching and without requiring anyone to praise him for it. It was only in the evenings, when he returned to Ashenvale and the long mahogany table with its 2-place settings, that the effectiveness felt hollow in the particular way of things that cost too much and produced too little. He thought about her at the strangest times. Not when he was alone, not in the evenings when the fire burned low and the estate was quiet. Those were the times he had learned to fill with work, with reading, with the careful maintenance of a life that functioned whether or not it meant anything. He thought about her at crowded moments. In the middle of negotiations, on horseback in bright weather, once, memorably, in the middle of a particularly tedious parliamentary debate, when a beam of winter light had come through the chamber windows and caught the dust in the air and he had thought, with a clarity that had nothing to do with parliamentary procedure. She would have found this tedious too. He had thought. I would have caught her eye across the room. He had thought. She would have given me that look, the one so controlled it might have been mistaken for no expression at all, except that he had learned, in 3 years of marriage, to read the vocabulary of her silences. He had thought. I miss being the person who could read her. The convent of St. Marin stood on the eastern cliffs above the gray sea. Anastasia had chosen it for reasons she had not fully articulated even to herself. It was remote. That was part of it. It was the kind of place that required intention to reach, a half-day's ride from the nearest town, up a road that became genuinely treacherous in winter, above a sea that was the color of iron and moved with the heavy indifference of something very old and not particularly interested in human concerns. It was the kind of place where you could not stumble into by accident. You had to mean to be there. She had meant to be there. The sisters of St. Marin were Benedictine and not given to excessive conversation, which suited Anastasia perfectly. The schedule was rigid. Prayers at dawn, work through the morning, study in the afternoon, prayers again at evening, silence after complying. The rhythm of it was like being held. Not warmly. The convent was cold. The stone walls exchanged winter's chill for summer's only reluctantly, but firmly. With a kind of impersonal steadiness that Anastasia had found, in those first months, to be the closest thing to peace she had experienced in years. She had not taken her vows immediately. She had arrived as a guest, then as an oblate, then as a novitiate, moving through each stage with the same deliberate caution she brought to everything. The sisters had watched her and said little. Sister Agatha, the eldest among them, had told her once, just once, that God had many rooms, and that not all of them required a permanent address. Anastasia had thought about that for 3 years before she understood it. In the 4th year, she was given charge of the convent's library. It was not a large library, perhaps 200 volumes, accumulated over a century and a half through donations and the occasional unexpected bequest from wealthy families whose consciences had gotten the better of them in old age. But Anastasia had organized it with the same precision she had brought to her household at Ashenvale, cataloging the volumes by subject and date of acquisition, repairing the bindings that had begun to fail, identifying the gaps, the missing volumes of sets, the damaged pages, the texts that existed only as references in other texts. She had written letters, in her careful hand, to booksellers and private collectors. Some of the letters had been answered. Some had not. The ones that were answered sometimes produced results. A parcel arriving at the convent gate, wrapped in oilcloth against the sea air, containing something Anastasia had not expected to feel so much pleasure at receiving. She had not thought of herself as a woman who loved books. She had thought of herself, for most of her life, as a woman who did what was required with efficiency and without complaint, and who kept the things she actually felt, the preferences and the passions and the particular texture of her private experience, carefully contained in some interior room that she had never quite trusted anyone else to enter. The library was the first place, in her memory, where she had been alone with her own preferences for long enough to discover what they actually were. She loved books. She loved the specific pleasure of a well-organized system. She loved the way knowledge built on itself, the way reading one text opened doors to 3 others. She loved the silence of the library in the early morning, before the other sisters were awake, when she could sit in the gray coastal light and read without any sense of obligation or performance. She did not, in those moments, allow herself to think about who she had been at Ashenvale. She was not entirely successful in this, but she was disciplined, and discipline covered a great deal of distance. Magnus hired a new steward in the 5th year. Carver had retired. His knees, he said, with the matter-of-fact dignity of old men who have decided their bodies are no longer a source of embarrassment but simply a logistical reality. And his replacement was a younger man named Aldous, competent and somewhat in awe of the Duke in the way of people who had heard the stories and had not yet spent enough time in his presence to replace the stories with something more accurate. Aldous had, in his first month, made the mistake of suggesting, gently, professionally, with every appearance of simply being thorough, that the standing order regarding the dinner table might be reviewed. Magnus had looked at him. Aldous had moved on to the next item on his list. The standing order was not reviewed. The chair remained. The table was set for 2. The household ran with the precision of a mechanism designed by someone who had decided that excellence was a form of survival and had acted accordingly. Magnus entertained occasionally. He could not avoid it entirely without giving society something to talk about, and he had developed a finely calibrated sense of how much withdrawal he could sustain before it became a statement rather than simply a preference. He hosted dinners. He attended the county gatherings that could not be declined without insult. He was present, sociable within the narrow parameters of his nature, and gave no one anything useful to say. He did not discuss Anastasia. He did not discuss the Duchess. If anyone noticed the standing order about the dinner table, and the perceptive ones did notice eventually, they had learned by now not to mention it. In the 5th year also, Anastasia had made a decision. She had been kneeling in the chapel during the evening office, listening to the sisters sing the psalms in their steady, unhurried way, when she had felt, with a certainty she had not expected and could not entirely explain, that she was not going to take her vows. It had not come as a dramatic revelation. She was suspicious of dramatic revelations. She had always found that the things she was most certain of arrived quietly, without announcement, the way the sun rises not all at once but through a gradual accumulation of light until the darkness is simply gone. She had prayed for 5 years. She had worked and studied and organized the library and sat with the dying when they were brought to the convent's infirmary, and learned to bake bread and repair stone walls and navigate the particular social ecosystem of a small community of women who had all, in their different ways, chosen to be there. She had found peace of a kind. A real peace, not the performance of it, the actual settled quality of a life that has found its own shape. But she had also found, in the honest way of someone who has had 5 years of enforced self-examination, that she was not called to this. Not permanently. She could live here and live well and serve God sincerely. She did not doubt the sincerity, which was a thing she had doubted desperately in the beginning. But vows were forever, and forever required a certainty she did not have. She had told Mother Superior. Mother Superior had nodded as though she had been expecting this and said that the door of the convent was always open, in both directions. She stayed 2 more years. Not because she was uncertain, but because she was cautious and because leaving required knowing where one was going, and she did not yet know that. The world she had left was still there. She knew this in the abstract. She received occasional letters from her cousin Mira, who wrote with the breathless energy of someone for whom no event was too small to narrate at length. From a former governess who had tracked her down through some mysterious network of elderly women who keep track of things. From no one else. Not from Magnus. She had not expected letters from Magnus. She had told herself she had not expected them. On the days when she was most honest with herself, the gray February days when the sea was particularly loud and the library was cold and the sisters' voices in the chapel sounded very far away, she acknowledged that there was a specific, small, unhealed place inside her that had waited, in the beginning, for a letter, not to be called back. She had not wanted to be called back. She had needed to leave, for reasons that she had spent 5 years examining and 2 years beyond that integrating. Reasons that had to do with the particular loneliness of being in a marriage where you loved someone you did not know how to reach and who did not know how to reach you, and the two of you had lived in the same house for 3 years getting more and more careful with each other until the care itself had become a wall. But she had wanted to know. She had wanted to know if the leaving had mattered. No letter had come. She had told herself this was fine. She had told herself many things, and by the 7th year she believed most of them. The 6th year brought a visitor to the convent. A young woman named Petra, barely 20, the daughter of a minor lord from the western provinces who had arrived at St. Marin in the state of comprehensive wreckage that Anastasia recognized, with something between compassion and alarm, as the state she herself had been in 7 years before. Anastasia had been assigned as her guide through the first weeks of adjustment. She had sat with Petra in the evenings, in the small garden that was sheltered enough from the sea wind to be usable even in late autumn, and let the girl talk. Petra talked at great length. She talked about her family and her expectations and the particular series of events that had led her here, and she asked Anastasia at the end of the 3rd evening why she had come. Anastasia had been quiet for a long time. She had told the truth eventually. Not all of it. The whole truth of a 7-year journey is not a thing that can be given to a 20-year-old girl in a garden without overwhelming her, but the essential truth. That she had been in a marriage that made her feel invisible. That she had needed to find out whether she existed outside of it. that she had come here to become, before anything else, someone she could recognize. Petra had nodded as though this made perfect sense. Petra had asked, "Did she know now?" Anastasia had looked at the sea, visible over the convent wall, dark and immense and entirely indifferent. She had said yes. What she did not say, what she turned over in her mind in the weeks that followed, was what she intended to do with the knowledge. The 7th year came in like all the others. Snow on the eastern cliffs, ice on the road from the town, the gray sea running with the heavy, dark energy it always had in deep winter. The sisters moved through the offices and the work and the silence with the same steady rhythm, the rhythm that had become the background of Anastasia's existence so completely that she sometimes forgot, briefly, that she had ever lived any differently. She was 29 now. She had arrived at St. Marin at 22 with very little sense of who she was beyond the roles she had been assigned. Daughter, ward, wife. She was leaving at 29 knowing, with a precision that was perhaps the most valuable thing she had acquired in 7 years, exactly who she was. She was a woman who loved order. She was a woman who felt things deeply and had spent a great many years being afraid that this was a weakness. She was a woman who had been, in her marriage, so afraid of asking for more than she was given that she had never once shown Magnus what more might look like. She was a woman who had made a mistake, of a kind that could not be undone but might, possibly, be addressed. She began to plan, not to return. She did not tell herself she was returning. She told herself she was going back to settle things properly, the legal complications of their situation, the practical questions that 7 years had left suspended, and that whatever she found there, she would handle it with the same steadiness she had learned in the chapel and the library and the gray light of the eastern cliffs. She wrote to her cousin Mira, who knew everything that happened in that part of the country, to say she was coming. Mira wrote back in 24 hours, which was practically instantaneous by postal standards, and the letter was very long and contained a great deal of information that Anastasia read 3 times. One detail, mentioned halfway through as though it were simply a piece of household gossip rather than the thing that stopped Anastasia's breath for a full 10 seconds, was that the Duke of Ashenvale continued to set 2 places at dinner. Anastasia put the letter down. She looked out her window at the sea. She sat there for a very long time. She arrived on the evening of the 24th of December. She had planned to arrive earlier, the morning, perhaps, or at least the afternoon, which would have been more sensible and would have given her time to compose herself before she had to face whatever was waiting at the end of that familiar drive. But the roads had been worse than anticipated, ice-glazed and slow, and the light had been failing for an hour by the time the carriage passed through the gates of Ashenvale. She had not told them she was coming. She had started to write a letter several times and had stopped herself each time, unable to finish it. Every version she began became either too formal or too much the opposite. Too much like a woman who had spent 7 years in a convent thinking about what she would say when she returned, which was exactly what she was, and which she was not ready to be, not in ink, not before she had had a chance to see his face. The drive through the gates was the same as she remembered. The elm trees, the particular way the estate sat in the landscape, neither imposing nor modest, simply present in the way of things that have been in the same place for a very long time and have stopped needing to justify it. The east wing where the study was, the windows lit amber from within. The south gardens were invisible under snow, but she knew exactly where they were, and could have walked them in complete darkness. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. This was information she filed away without comment. The carriage stopped before the front steps. She had forgotten, in 7 years, the particular scale of the estate's entrance, or rather, she had remembered it incorrectly, the way one always misremembers the physical reality of places that have acquired emotional significance. She had remembered it as imposing. It was simply large. Large in the uncomplicated way of a house built by people who had the resources for space and the sense to use them without ostentation. She sat in the carriage for perhaps 30 seconds. She was 29 years old. She had spent 7 years in a convent on a cliff above the gray sea. She had catalogued 200 books and repaired 100 yards of stone wall and sat with 7 dying women and taught herself to bake bread that was, by the 7th year, genuinely very good. She had survived 7 winters that would have defeated her at 22. She could get out of a carriage. She got out of the carriage. The cold hit her immediately, The specific cold of inland winter, drier and sharper than the coastal cold she had lived in for 7 years, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and frozen ground and something she could not name that might have been memory or might simply have been Ashenvale in December, which she had lived through 3 times before. The front door opened before she reached the steps. Aldous was there. She did not know him. A young man she had never seen, who looked at her with an expression that moved rapidly through several stages before settling on something carefully composed. He said nothing yet. She understood that he was waiting to understand what was required of him. She told him her name. She watched his face as he processed this, and then she watched him make a decision, and she knew from the decision he made, the small bow, the step back, the door opened wider, that whatever he had heard about her, he had decided to receive her. She was shown to the blue sitting room, which was not where she had expected to wait. She had expected to wait in the entrance hall, or perhaps the formal drawing room. Spaces appropriate to someone whose status in the house was uncertain, someone who might or might not be received. The blue sitting room was a private room, a family room, a room where you put people you expected to stay. She did not know whether this was Aldous' decision or the result of standing instructions she was not aware of. She sat in the blue sitting room and looked at the things in it. The room had changed in small ways. A different rug, different curtains, a new arrangement of the books on the low shelf by the window. She had organized those books herself, and someone had reorganized them, not badly but differently. The painting above the fireplace was the same. The fireplace itself was the same, lit and burning well, which suggested either that someone had told them she was coming after all, or that the rooms at Ashenvale were kept ready as a matter of course. She was inclined to believe the latter. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the sounds of the house around her. This house had a specific acoustic quality. Old stone and high ceilings and the particular way that wood-framed windows slightly amplified the sound of the wind, that she had forgotten entirely and now recognized with the disorienting completeness of sensory memory, which is more primitive and more reliable than any other kind. She had lived here. She had lived in this house. It was strange to remember this as a fact rather than as an abstraction. Magnus was in the study when Aldous came to tell him. He was reviewing estate accounts, which was the kind of work he did in the evenings in December because December was when the year's reckoning came due and he preferred to face reckoning head-on rather than discover them sideways. He had been at it for 2 hours and had reached a point of productive concentration where the numbers were beginning to tell their story clearly. Aldous came in and said something. Magnus heard the words. He understood the words individually. He was familiar with each of the words Aldous had used. They were ordinary words, the kind of words that appear in sentences all the time without incident. The sentence they formed, however, was not an ordinary sentence. He looked at Aldous for a moment. Aldous had the expression of a man delivering news he is not certain will be received well, and who has decided that the only reasonable strategy is to be completely accurate and let the reaction take whatever form it takes. Magnus closed the ledger. He stood. He asked Aldous where she was. He did not go immediately. He stood in the study for perhaps 2 minutes after Aldous left, doing nothing in particular. Not thinking, not feeling, not doing any of the things one is supposed to do in moments of extreme and unexpected significance. He simply stood and let the information settle into him the way very cold water settles, filling every space. She was here. After 7 years, on Christmas Eve, in the blue sitting room, she was here. He did not ask himself why. He did not allow himself, in those 2 minutes, to run forward into speculation about motive or intention or what this meant for what came next. He had spent 7 years being disciplined about Anastasia, 7 years maintaining the careful architecture of a life that functioned without her, 7 years refusing to indulge in the particular self-destruction of hope without basis. He would not ruin those 2 minutes with speculation. He straightened his coat. He looked briefly at the letter he still carried. Moved it from coat pocket to coat pocket for 7 years, soft at the folds now. Handled so often the paper had changed texture, and he did not take it out. He simply confirmed that it was there, which it always was. He walked to the blue sitting room. She was standing when he came in. She had been sitting, but she had heard footsteps in the corridor and stood before the door opened, which was characteristic of her. She had always preferred to meet things on her feet rather than be caught sitting. He stopped in the doorway. She stood by the fireplace, and the firelight was behind her, and she was 29 instead of 22 in 7 years was a long time, but it was also, he discovered in that moment, absolutely no time at all. She looked the same in the ways that mattered. The straight posture, the dark eyes, the expression that contained a great deal more than it displayed, that he had spent 3 years of marriage learning to read, that he now read without thinking. She was uncertain and she was afraid, and she was covering both of these things with the controlled stillness that was her oldest and most reliable defense. He knew this about her. He had always known this. He had never, in 3 years of marriage, told her that he knew. They looked at each other across the blue sitting room, with the fire burning between them and 7 years of silence in the air, and neither of them moved for a long moment, and the clock on the mantelpiece ticked, and outside the windows the snow was falling on Ashenvale. The same snow that had fallen on the night she left, patient and indifferent and very beautiful. He moved first. He walked into the room. Not toward her, not directly, not with the kind of intention that would have required her to decide something immediately, and he sat in the chair nearest the fire, the high-backed one he had always preferred, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 3 years of marriage. She could not name it precisely. She had known Magnus as composed, as capable and decisive and occasionally formidable in the way of men who have never had to be afraid. She had known him as a man who managed his emotions with the same efficient competence he brought to everything else, not suppressing them, she had always sensed, but simply organizing them so thoroughly they could not interfere with function. The expression she was seeing now was organized, but it was not composed. There was something in it that had survived 7 years without being organized into usefulness, and she could see it there, plainly, which was something she had never been able to do before. She sat down too, across from him. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. They were in the same room. After 7 years, they were in the same room, close enough to speak, close enough that she could see the gray that had appeared at his temples, the slight change in the set of his jaw that came with years and whatever those years had held. She had not known what this moment would feel like. It felt like the end of holding her breath for a very long time. She had come with a purpose. She had rehearsed it during the long carriage ride from the coast. Rehearsed not what she would say, since she was not the kind of person who prepared speeches, but what she intended. The intent was clear. She had come to address the practical situation they were in, the legal ambiguity, the question of what their lives were now after 7 years and what they were going to do about it. She had framed it to herself as a practical matter because that was the framing she could carry on the journey without it falling apart. The practical matter, as she understood it, was this. She had left. She had stayed. She had decided not to take her vows. She had decided to return to the world. The question of what returning to the world looked like when you had left a husband behind in it was a practical question, and practical questions had answers, and she had come here to find the answer. This was what she had told herself on the carriage road. She had not told herself on the carriage road what Myra's letter had said about the empty chair. She had not allowed herself to think about the empty chair, because the empty chair was not a practical matter. The empty chair was something else entirely, and she had spent 7 years becoming a woman who could withstand things, but she was not certain she could withstand the empty chair. At some point, she would not be able to say exactly when. Aldous appeared at the door and indicated, with the quiet professionalism of a good steward, that dinner would be served whenever the Duke wished. Magnus looked at Aldous. Something passed between them. Some form of communication that had clearly been established over years of working together, and Aldous nodded and withdrew. Anastasia understood, a few minutes later, that they were going to dinner. She understood this with a complex internal response that she did not attempt to fully inventory at the moment. She had eaten thousands of dinners in this house. She had eaten dinner here on the night she decided to leave. She had eaten dinner here on the night of their wedding, surrounded by family and society and the particular performance of a public occasion, and she had been very aware of Magnus beside her and had not known what to do with the awareness. She had not eaten dinner here in 7 years. She walked with him through the corridor to the dining room. The corridor was the same. The oil paintings in their familiar sequence on the wall. The particular smell of the house, wood smoke and beeswax and something she associated entirely with Ashenvale, had no other reference for. The sound of her own footsteps on the stone floor, which she had not heard in 7 years and which she recognized with an intimacy that had nothing to do with thought. Magnus walked beside her and did not speak. She had always respected this about him. His ability to not speak without making the silence uncomfortable. It was a rarer quality than it sounded. She saw the chair before she saw anything else in the dining room. She could not have explained this. The room was large, the table was long. There were many things to see. But her eyes went directly to the chair to the right of the Duke's place, the chair that was Anastasia's chair, the chair that was her chair. It was set. It had a place setting in front of it. China, silver, crystal, a folded napkin. That was not dusty, not decorative, not the setting of a shrine. It was a dinner setting. A dinner setting set by someone who expected the seat to be used. She stopped walking. She stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at her chair with its perfect place setting, and she felt something happen in her chest that she had no name for, in any of the 7 languages she had read about grief and loss and the things people do to survive them. The chair had been there for 7 years. Through 7 Christmases, 7 harvests, 7 summers when the South Garden was in bloom and 20 people could have sat around this table and no one was invited. Through all the dinners where Magnus had eaten alone at the head of this table, with his correspondence and his estate accounts and the particular quiet of a man who has made his peace with something and not entirely managed it. The chair had been there. The candles in the holder nearest it. She noticed this now, could not stop herself from noticing, were fresh. They had been replaced today. This morning or this afternoon, before she had arrived, before anyone had known she was coming. She sat down. It was the only thing to do. She sat in her chair, the chair that had been waiting for her for 7 years, and she spread the napkin across her lap with hands that were not entirely steady, and she looked at the candles in front of her, burning clear and bright. Magnus sat at the head of the table to her left. The servants moved around them with the practiced efficiency of a household that runs well, setting soup before them, withdrawing, leaving them in the candlelit privacy of the long room. She had been afraid on the carriage road that she would not know how to be in his company. 7 years was long enough to unlearn everything. Long enough for the person she had known to have become someone else, someone she would have to meet fresh. She had not expected it to feel like this, like resuming something, like a piece of music picking up after a long pause, finding the same key, the same tempo, as though the silence had simply been an interlude and not an ending. It was not that things were the same. Things were not the same. She was not the same. He was not the same, she suspected, although his stillness was so similar to what she remembered that it was difficult to be certain what had changed underneath it. But there was a quality to sitting beside him that she had forgotten was possible. The quality of being with someone who knew her. Not all of her. They had barely begun to know each other in 3 years before she left. But enough. Enough that the silence between them had a different texture than the silence she had maintained for 7 years in a convent, which was the silence of solitude. This was the silence of company, of shared space, of 2 people who had a history and were sitting in the middle of it. They ate. The soup was good. The cook at Ashenvale had always been excellent, and apparently time had not changed this. She ate her soup and was aware of the specific quality of her own hunger, which had not been about food for a very long time. She looked at him, at one point, from the corner of her eye, and found him looking at her with an expression that was quickly reorganized into something neutral before she could fully read it. But she had caught the edge of it, and it was the same expression she had seen in the doorway of the blue sitting room, the thing that had survived 7 years of organizing. She thought about Myra's letter, about the single detail that had stopped her breath. She thought about what it meant that the candles were fresh. She thought about a man who had received a 14-word letter from his wife and had not sent after her and had not sought an annulment and had not rearranged his dining room for 7 years, as though keeping a space empty was the same as keeping something safe. She thought. She had spent 7 years becoming a woman who could ask for things. She had not quite tested this yet. She looked at the chair she was sitting in. She thought about all the dinners it had missed. All the Christmas Eves. She set down her spoon with great care. She turned to look at him. He had looked at her. She had turned to look at him and he had been looking at her already, as though he had been waiting for this, for her to stop looking at the candles and the chair and the snow outside the windows and look, finally, at him. In 3 years of marriage, she thought, She had never held his gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. She held it now. There was no calculation in it. No performance. 7 years had apparently consumed her capacity for performance, which she had once considered a survival strategy and now understood was simply a wall, and she had spent 7 years on the other side of the wall learning that she could, in fact, survive without it. He looked at her with 7 years in his face, and she looked at him, and the candles burned between them, and outside it was Christmas Eve and the snow was falling on the estate and the garden and the road she had come up 2 hours ago, and the chair was not empty. She had made a mistake. She knew this with the clarity she had learned in the convent, the clarity that comes from years of honest self-examination. Not comfortable clarity, not the kind that lets you off easily, but the real kind, the kind that requires you to see yourself as you actually are and not as you prefer to be. She had been afraid. She had been, in her marriage, so deeply afraid of being seen clearly, and found wanting that she had solved the problem by not being seen at all. By being correct and controlled and present in every physical sense while keeping the real and essential self. The self that loved books and felt things too much and wanted to be known. Behind a wall so high and so old she had not even been fully aware it was there. She had solved her fear by leaving. This was, she now knew, a mistake of the first order. What she did not know, what she had not allowed herself to know until she was sitting in this chair, in this room, looking at him across 7 years, was whether it was a mistake that could be addressed. She was a precise woman. She had learned, at St. Maron, that precision was not the same as coldness, that it was simply a way of honoring things by taking them seriously. She took this seriously. She did not know what he wanted. She could not assume, from the evidence of the chair, from the dinner set for 2, from the fresh candles, from the 7 years of a standing order that no one had been instructed to change. She could not assume that these things meant what she hoped they meant. People maintain habits for all kinds of reasons. People were afraid to change things for all kinds of reasons. The chair might mean that he missed her. It might mean that he was angry and the chair was the object of anger's object. It might mean simply that he was a man of unusual loyalty to his own domestic arrangements. She did not know. She had not, she realized, allowed herself to think about what she hoped it meant, because hope was the most dangerous thing she carried, and she had learned to carry it only when she had somewhere safe to put it down. But she was here, and the chair was not empty, and he was looking at her, and she had spent 7 years learning to stop solving the problem by leaving. After dinner, they went to the blue sitting room. This was apparently what happened at Ashenvale on winter evenings. She remembered this, the migration from dining room to sitting room, the fire maintained and the tea brought without being asked for, the particular domestic rhythm of a well-run house settling into its evening mode. She sat on the settee nearest the window. He sat in the high-back chair again, across from her, and accepted the tea that appeared without looking at it. She thought about the things she needed to say and the order in which she needed to say them and whether she was capable of saying them or whether 7 years of prayer and stone walls and gray sea had given her the strength she needed or whether she was still, underneath all of it, the 22-year-old woman who had packed 3 dresses and a portrait and run away rather than risk being asked to be known. She thought, you went to a convent for 7 years. You can do the hard thing. She looked at the fire. She thought about the portrait she had brought with her. Still in the hatbox, she had packed it again when she left St. Maron. She was not going to examine why too closely. And she thought about the 14-word letter, and she thought about what it would mean to begin again and what beginning again actually required. It required, she thought, saying the true thing. She had spent her whole life not saying the true thing. She had spent her whole life being accurate and controlled and present and never saying the true thing. She was 29 years old, and she was sitting in a room with the man she had left and the fire was burning and it was Christmas Eve. She looked at him. He was watching her. He had been watching her since she walked through his door, with the focused attention of a man who is being very careful to observe accurately and not to observe what he wants to observe, which was a distinction Magnus had always been capable of making and which was one of the things she had respected about him, even in the years when she had been too afraid to be observed. She saw him make a decision. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He removed a piece of paper, small, folded many times, soft with handling, and he held it in his hands for a moment without opening it and without explaining what it was, and then he set it on the table between them. She knew what it was. She had written it in handwriting that was still hers, 7 years later, still recognizable. She had seen it in the library at St. Marin and knew her own hand. He had carried her letter for 7 years. She looked at the letter. She looked at him. Something was happening in her chest that she had learned, in 7 years, to allow to happen without immediately controlling it. She reached across the table. She did not take the letter. She put her hand beside it, not touching it, not touching him, but there, present, visible, real. He looked at her hand. He looked at her. Outside, the snow fell on Ashenvale, on the south garden, on the elm trees at the drive, on the road that came up from the town. The clock in the hall struck 11, 1 hour until Christmas. She had come home on Christmas Eve unaware. Or perhaps not entirely unaware. Perhaps, on some level she had not examined too closely. She had known exactly what she was returning to. Had known and had not let herself know because she was still, in some small but important way, the woman who protected herself by not looking too directly at the things she wanted. She looked now. She was 29 years old and she had spent 7 years becoming someone capable of this moment, and she was going to be capable of it. She looked at Magnus, at the gray at his temples and the 7 years in his face and the letter on the table between them, and she let him see that she was looking. The clock struck midnight. It struck with the full, unhurried resonance of a clock that had been keeping time in the same house for 50 years and had no reason to rush. 1, then 2, then 12, each stroke landing in the quiet blue sitting room with the finality of something official, something marked. It was Christmas. She was still sitting across from him, and he was still sitting across from her, and the letter was still on the table between them, and her hand was still beside it, and nothing had resolved and everything had changed. This was, she thought, the difference between the woman who had left and the woman who had returned. The woman who left could not have sat in this room, with this much unresolved, without the unresolvedness becoming unbearable. Without needing to close it or escape it or file it away somewhere she would not have to feel it. The woman who returned could sit with it. She could sit in the middle of the 7 years and the letter and the chair and the fresh candles and let it be as complicated as it actually was, and trust that complicated things could be inhabited, that they did not require immediate resolution to be survivable. Magnus picked up the letter. He turned it in his hands, not opening it, not giving it to her, simply holding it with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered to him. She had watched him handle important documents this way, in their 3 years of marriage, with a kind of respectful deliberateness that was the physical expression of taking something seriously. Then he put it away. He put it back in the inner pocket of his coat, the same pocket it had apparently lived in for 7 years, and he looked at her with the expression she still could not fully name, and he left it there. She stayed the night at Ashenvale. This was not a decision so much as a reality. It was midnight, it was Christmas, the roads were ice and snow, and she had, in any case, nowhere else she was going. She had come here. This was where she had come. Aldous showed her to a guest room, which was the correct decision, the decision of a household maintaining appropriate care until told otherwise, and she thanked him and stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The room was clean. The fire was lit. There were flowers on the dressing table, winter flowers, forced blooms in a small vase, the kind that required effort to produce in December. She did not ask when they had been put there. She changed into her traveling clothes from the trunk her driver had brought up, because she had not yet arranged for her things, and she stood at the window and looked out at Ashenvale in the snow at midnight on Christmas morning, and she felt something that was not quite peace and not quite grief and not quite joy but contained elements of all three in the proportion that honest things contain multiple emotions simultaneously. She had come back. This was not the end of anything, and it was not a clean beginning, and nothing was resolved and a great deal needed to be addressed. The legal questions, the practical questions, the fundamental question of whether two people who had failed at the same marriage could do something different in it. These were real questions. They did not have automatic answers. But she was here. In this room, in this house, with her chair not empty at the table below. She had thought, on the carriage road, that she was coming to settle things. She understood now that settling and beginning were sometimes the same gesture. Magnus did not sleep. This was not unusual. He had not been a reliable sleeper in the 7 years of Anastasia's absence, which he had eventually accepted as simply a feature of his existence rather than a symptom of anything particular. He had learned to use the sleepless hours productively, reading, reviewing accounts, the kind of correspondence that benefited from the concentrated attention of the small hours. Tonight he did not attempt any of these things. He sat in the east study, the room where Carver had found him on the night she left, where he had read 14 words and understood that his life had changed in a direction he had not anticipated, and he looked at the fire. He had carried her letter for 7 years. He had not sent after her because she had made a choice, and he believed in choices, in the absolute necessity of respecting the choices of other people even when those choices cost you everything. He had believed this and he still believed it, and it had cost him 7 years of dinners alone and winters alone and the particular loneliness of a man who has someone to miss and no acceptable way to address the missing. He had kept the chair because he was honest with himself ultimately, even when the honesty was inconvenient. He had kept the chair because removing it would have been a lie, would have said that he was finished, that he had moved on, that what had existed between them was over. And he was not finished. He had not moved on. And what had existed between them, incomplete and obstructed and full of things unsaid, was not over in his assessment until it was actually over, and it had not been actually over. She had come back. He sat with this fact in the east study at 1 in the morning on Christmas Day, and he did not allow himself to run ahead of it into speculation, and he simply sat with it. She had come back. In the morning, Christmas morning, gray and cold and brilliant with the particular brightness of new snow. She came downstairs to find the table set for 2. This did not surprise her. She stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the table. 2 settings, 2 chairs, the candles unlit in the morning light, and she felt something settle in her. A weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was separate from her, setting itself down. Magnus was already there. He was at the window, looking out at the south garden under snow, and he turned when he heard her. They looked at each other in the morning light, which was less dramatic than candlelight and more accurate, and she was glad of the accuracy. She crossed the room. She did not sit in her chair, not yet. She went to the window where he was and stood beside him, and they looked out at the garden together. The snow had covered everything. The paths, the hedges, the stone bench where she had sometimes sat in summer. Under the snow, the structure of the garden was still there, the bones of it, the design, the intention, just covered, waiting. This too felt accurate. She had not known, coming up the drive on Christmas Eve, that the chair was waiting. She had not known that the candles were fresh. She had not known that 7 years of silence could contain that much care, or that care could take that shape. Not demonstrative, not declared, but maintained, daily, through 7 winters, through every dinner alone. She had not known, and now she did know, and knowing it was the beginning of something that would take time and work and honesty in quantities she had not previously attempted. She had never been afraid of work. She had been afraid of being seen. She was not afraid anymore. She stood beside Magnus at the window on Christmas morning, the snow bright and deep on everything, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and the silence between them was not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say to each other. It was the silence of 2 people with everything before them. The house was quiet around them. The fire was burning. The table was set. Christmas morning at Ashenvale, and the Duchess had come home. The chair was never moved. Not because the story required it to stay empty, it was not empty now, but because some things, once established, simply remain. Objects and rituals and domestic faiths that survive everything asked of them and become, by surviving, something more than habit. It was Anastasia's chair. It had always been Anastasia's chair. Mira would write the following month, demanding a full accounting of what had happened. The letter Anastasia wrote back was long and honest, and contained things she would not have been able to write at 22. The solicitor Hartwell was informed that no annulment would be required after all. He received this information without comment, which was the most professional thing he had ever done. Aldous continued to run the household with brisk competence and never mentioned the standing order again. He had understood, on the night she arrived, that the standing order had become redundant. He did not require this to be stated explicitly. The letter, 14 words, soft with folding, worn at the creases, stayed in the pocket of Magnus' coat for a while longer. He took it out one evening, months later, when Anastasia was reading beside him in the east study, and he set it on the desk between them. She picked it up. She read what she had written 7 years ago. She sat with it. Then she put it in the fireplace and they watched it burn together, and the light it gave off was brief and clean and final, and then it was done and the room was warm and outside it was some ordinary season, not Christmas, not any marked time, just the daily unremarkable life of two people who had been given the rarest thing. A second chance they had not wasted. If the story touched you, leave a like and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It means everything to know how far these stories travel. Subscribe to join us for the next tale. Until then, may every dark road lead you somewhere worth arriving.